malignant arrhythmia. But I don't know how many of us have actually seen that happening. I have not seen it in my practice. Dr. Narasimhan can comment. RONT was thought to be very, very sinister. Dr. Green, would you like to comment?
Back in the days of prevention of ventricular fibrillation during myocardial infarction, it was not one of the things that we were concerned about. But it isn't anymore. It's just not something that we worry about.
Thank you.
I now request Dr. Ramesh Pai to felicitate our speaker, Dr. Bobby John. I request Dr. Bobby John to hand over the certificates to the chairpersons.
For the next session, I invite the chairpersons. Dr. Satish is the Assistant Professor of Electrophysiology at Sri Jayadeva Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences, Bangalore. Dr. Meenakshi Shetty, Professor of Medicine in KMC, Mangalore. And Dr. Subhash Pujari, Professor of Medicine at DM Wayanad Institute, Kerala. Kindly take your seats. I invite Dr. Ram Prakash onto the dais to speak on long and short of QT syndromes. I request the chairpersons to introduce Dr. Ram Prakash.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The next topic for today is long and short of QT syndrome. The speaker is Dr. Ram Prakash. He's done his MD DM and is a fellow in EP studies. Experience is post DM 10 years, 6 years in EP, and he is presently consultant electrophysiologist at GKNM Hospital, Coimbatore, and Indiana Hospital, Mangalore.
Thank you, chairpersons, and good evening, everybody. So, actually, it is easy to follow up on the previous talk of how to measure the QT interval and what are the types of QT prolongations you can get. So, to briefly recapture what he has told, so QT interval is nothing but the beginning of the QRS to the end of the T wave. Of course, he has described how to measure the QT interval in various situations, and it implies the duration of activation and duration of recovery of the ventricular myocardium. It is the total period of time when the ventricular myocardium is electrically active. So either it is depolarizing or repolarizing. The time of the time interval for the myocardium when it is electrically active is the QT interval. Okay. So out of all these waves, it is from the beginning of the Q to the end of the T wave is the QT interval, the time duration where the myocardium, ventricular myocardium is electrically active. Some electrical activity is going on in the ventricular myocardium. And there are things that drive this electrical activity, either depolarization or repolarization. And there are ion channels that drive these processes in the ventricular myocardium. And I have been specifically told not to talk about the ion channels. So please don't worry, I am not going to talk about the ion channels, but it is important to remember that sodium, calcium, potassium ions go inside, outside, these things keep happening to maintain this depolarization and repolarization in the ion channels. So, in brief, I am not going to deal with this again. We have various formulas to correlate and to, to calculate the QT interval and to measure the corrected QT interval. The corrected QT interval is the time taken for the ventricular myocardium to depolarize and then repolarize in correction to the heart rate of the patient. Okay. So miscalculations he has already told, and you should use lead 2 or V5 and V6 to calculate the QT interval. Not all leads are equal in this. And U waves, he has already told you how to, be careful about the U waves and T waves. And this is one of the pitfalls that I would like you to remember. What was not covered is, what is the cutoff of QT interval? So coming to the basic ECG measurements, to the clinical implications of the QT interval. So what is the cutoff of QT interval that you need to be worried about? When do you say it is QT prolongation? The classical teaching is 440 milliseconds for males and 460 milliseconds for females. But we see that there is a significant amount of overlap when we use these cutoffs. So if you want to look at the danger levels, then probably 470 milliseconds in males and 480 milliseconds in females will be a kind of QT prolongation where events are little bit higher. And as a rule of thumb, more than 500 milliseconds is definitely danger. More than 500 milliseconds is definitely a danger. So why are we worried about QT interval? It is because of torsades. So what is this torsades? What is this TDP? Why QT prolongation should produce TDP? Have anybody thought about that? QT prolongation, I am scared. Why? Because torsades, bizarre ECG here and there, very fast, patient will die. That is all we know about. But why? Why QT prolongation should cause torsades? The point is why it should cause. So from long QT to TDP, it is a very simple mechanism. I'll just tell you in very simple words why QT prolongation causes TDP. Now, if you look at the cardiac action potential, so the action potential, as you all know, has 4 phases, which is best seen in the Purkinje. I'll try to get the Purkinje here. Yeah, any of these muscle this thing. Phase 0, which is rapid depolarization, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So these are the 4 phases. So this is depolarization and repolarization changes. So if you look at the cardiac muscle fibers, the action potential duration is not the same in all the muscle fibers in the heart itself. So if you look at the myocardium in specific, the ventricular myocardium in specific, we can see that there are 3 areas in the ventricular myocardium, which is the endocardium, the mid-myocardium, and the epicardium. And though these are the part of the same myocardial tissue, they are electrically dissociated. They have little bit different electrical properties, thereby having little bit different duration of action potential, or the action potential duration and the shape of the action potential is different. And the refractory period is different. The refractory period is when it is actually depolarizing and the time till it reaches the baseline membrane potential. So from here to here, it is a refractory period. So if you see, the endocardium and epicardium has a shorter refractory period, whereas the mid-myocardial cells has a longer refractory period. So, like Dr. Yash had, I think he has presented, Dr. Sriram had presented a typical example of a AV nodal reentrant tachycardia. What was the problem there? 2 adjacent tissue, which are anatomically adjacent, but have different electrical properties. One has a short refractory period, one has a long refractory period. So when an impulse enters this area, it will pass through the area with the short refractory period, which will recover first, and then where a long refractory period will be refractory at that time. But once that is passed through that area, it will come back and find the area of long refractory period to be receptive again and set up a reentrant circuit. The same thing can happen in the ventricular myocardium because of this differential properties of the mid-myocardial part of the electrical properties of the mid-myocardial part of the ventricular myocardium. So in patients with normal QT, the difference between this mid-myocardium and epicardial and endocardial myocardial cells are not very different. So it's almost same. So the difference between the refractoriness is not very gross. So the transmural dispersion of repolarization, that is what is the difference in refractoriness of the muscle fibers in the mid-myocardium as compared to epicardium and endocardium is not great. But what happens in long QT is the mid-myocardium starts to have a very long action potential duration and increased refractoriness. So when the impulse is passing through the ventricular endocardium or epicardium, this is refractory. But once it has come out of the endocardium, this will start conducting again, and it will set up a re-entry between the endocardium and the mid-myocardial tissue. Here it is not a very regular re-entry like a AV nodal reentrant tachycardia, but here it is very bizarre, very fast, and very lethal. So this is what happens, and this is what produces Torsades point is in patients having long QT syndrome. So this is what happens in patients having long QT syndrome. The transmural dispersion for repolarization is very different from the mid-myocardium when compared to the epicardium and endocardium and this will produce a intramural re-entry and produce TORS as the pointers. So this is how it translates from a long QT into a torsades or a malignant ventricular arrhythmia. It is nothing but the differential properties of the mid-myocardial and the endocardial and epicardial muscle fibers producing this reentrant phenomenon. And coming to congenital long QTs. All these congenital long QTs are because of the ion channel defects in either in the sodium channel or the potassium channel and sometimes calcium channel. So there are only 3 channels in this aspect. So these things can produce long QT syndromes. The commonest is long QT1, the next is long QT2, and others are not that common. Long QT3 is the least common, and others are rarities and case reports. So to just give you an idea, the affects around 1 in 2,000 to 5,000 people worldwide. So WPW is around 2 in 1,000. So here it is around 1 in 2,000. It is not that uncommon. So it is not an uncommon disease. The only thing is you have to look for it. You have to look for QT prolongation in patients having syncope. It is not a rarity. It is there. And especially in patients having sudden cardiac arrest or syncope, recurrent syncope, this diagnosis has to be specifically looked for by means that were already discussed by Dr. Bobby John. So the clinical presentation is wide, can range from lifelong asymptomatic course to sudden death in infancy. And 10 to 50% of cases of long QT do not have baseline QT prolongation. See, after discussing so much about long QT syndrome, how to measure this, that, and now I want to tell you that 10 to 15% do not have QT prolongation at baseline. It can only be transient and can be brought out by provocative maneuvers. So the risk of events increase with increase in QT. The cutoff is 500 milliseconds. More than 500 milliseconds, the incidence of malignant events become much higher. And recurrent syncope seizures occur at around 50% of patients before the age of 15 years and around 90% by the age of 40 years. Though I have patients at 80 years who has had the first episode of VT or torsades. So males have events during childhood, females during adolescence or childbirth or even after menopause. So coming to risk stratification in patients already known to have long QT syndrome. So low risk, QT of less than 500 milliseconds, no clinical events. These are patients and no prior syncope, patients having low risk. High risk, so those who need primary prevention is either had a syncope but their QT is more than 500 milliseconds. And patients who have survived sudden cardiac arrest are at the highest risk. Of course, Dr. Bobby John has presented the different features of long QT syndrome. Just to brush through this, so near drowning, always think of long QT1. Exercise induced, always think of long QT1. So these are the symptoms of long QT1. And of course, he has shown you the broad-based T wave that is very typical of long QT1 syndrome. Second one is sudden death during sleep, that is auditory stimulus, alarm clock. So this is long QT2. Long QT2 can produce sudden death during an auditory stimulus. And peripartum or postpartum sudden deaths, a part of it can be due to long QT2. And ECG, 2 will have 2 peaks, notched T waves in long QT2. Or there can be this, what is this, very flat T waves, or these things can be present in, or humps in the descending limb of the T wave, or 2 peaks in T waves can be due to long QT2. Long QT3 is silent death during night. So this, or it can manifest as sudden jerky movement during sleep, or nightmares. These things can be seen in long QT3. So long QT3 is a long isoelectric line followed by a T wave. So that is a long QT3. So of course long QT7 and long QT8, these are all rarities associated with dysmorphic features and long QT in the ECG and the malignant ventricular arrhythmias and bizarre T waves. So, and genetic testing, only 50% will have known mutations. 50% of congenital long QT syndrome still may not have known mutations. So purely relying on genetic testing alone is not very useful. So the other thing is clinical misdiagnosis. This is very, very important. So whenever you have a patient who has sudden death or sudden a malignant cardiac event during exercise or during swimming, you have to think of long QT1. Very easy to misdiagnose as vasovagal, or long QT2 as auditory stimulus. Easy to misdiagnose as epilepsy. Long QT3 during sleep. The patient may have near-death experience during sleep, may be misdiagnosed as episodes of sleep apnea or jerky movements during sleep. So clues, workup. So the most important clue is the ECG. Just baseline 12-lead ECG. If you take care to look at it very carefully to measure the QT, then you have the diagnosis. But like I told you, 10 to 15% may not have a long QT during the baseline ECG. Without any provocative maneuvers, you may not be able to elicit this long QT finding. So you can use Holter monitoring. One clue is the paradoxic behavior of QT with heart rate. Either the QT interval will remain the same or it will prolong with decrease in heart rate. And dynamic T-wave changes during exercise or during exertion. And exercise testing, again the same thing can be seen. The QT interval fails to come down with exercise and increase in heart rate, or the heart rate itself may not increase during exercise. Then epinephrine test, of course, he has already told about epinephrine test quite clearly. And so this is what will happen. You have to give epinephrine and look for increase in QT interval, not the QTC. The QT interval, absolute increase in 0.3 is taken as significant. Of course, Schwartz criteria has already been described. So the findings are here. If you see QT of more than QTC of more than 480 milliseconds is taken as a given the maximum weightage. So. So this is about congenital long QT syndromes. There are conditions that predispose torsades in patients having congenital long QT syndromes. Or when these conditions are extreme enough, they can produce torsades even in patients not having a underlying long QT syndrome. So what are the conditions? Are acquired conditions that can prolong the QT and precipitate torsades. So these are which can predispose to torsades de pointes in patients having congenital long QT syndrome is underlying cardiac disease like underlying hypertrophy, heart failure, antiarrhythmic therapy, electrolyte abnormalities, all these hypocalcemia, hypomagnesemia, and hypokalemia, and hypothyroidism, anorexia, and hypo or hyperglycemia. All these things can cause QT prolongation and precipitate torsades in patients having this long QT syndrome. I still remember we had a very young 17-year-old boy with polyglandular autoimmune syndrome. He had diabetes with hypoparathyroidism and type 4 renal tubular acidosis. So he had hypokalemia, he had hypocalcemia, he had uncontrolled diabetes. He used to have recurrent ventricular arrhythmias and referred for an ICD implant. But once we diagnosed him as having this polyglandular autoimmune syndrome, and after replacement of hormones, his arrhythmias totally disappeared. So this is an interesting case where you have to see the conditions that is producing these malignant ventricular arrhythmias, and you have to, and most of the answers lies in general medicine, not in cardiology or electrophysiology. So coming to, and other things that can precipitate TDP is bradyarrhythmias, and sympathetic and female gender is another one. And risk factors for drug-induced torsades. So you have so many drugs that can produce torsades de pointes, but the thing is, these drugs, when they are given as a rapid bolus, given rapidly, given as a loading dose, have an increased chance of producing TDP. So it is very important to monitor the patient when you are loading them with these drugs or when you are initiating them with these drugs. So concurrent use of other drugs, which can also produce QT prolongation, will increase the risk exponentially. And risk factors for drug-induced TDP, again, apart from other drugs that can produce prolonged QT, the other factors that can prolong QT should also be kept in mind, like again underlying heart disease, then same hypoelectrolytemias, and other things like this thing. So coming to management of long QT syndrome. There are few things that can be done in patients having recurrent torsades, in patients having long QT syndrome. So coming to acquired long QT syndrome and congenital long QT syndromes. In acquired long QT syndromes, the important things I'll discuss about is magnesium, pharmacological therapy with magnesium, isoproteinol, role of temporary pacing, role of potassium and other drugs. So magnesium is the antidote for torsades in patients having long QT syndrome. So this is one thing I like you to remember. Magnesium is the drug of choice for torsades. The point is due to long QT syndrome. So first line therapy, it is effective in both treating treatment and prevention of ventricular arrhythmias, but the benefit occurs without shortening of QT. Magnesium levels will increase, but QT will remain the same. You have to withdraw the offending agent, then only the QT will become normal. So it is given as a bolus of 2 gram IV bolus and followed by a continuous infusion, or sometimes you can give it periodically. And temporary pacing. So temporary pacing, like I told you, the conditions that can precipitate torsades in patients already having long QT, one of which is bradycardia. Bradycardia can significantly increase the QT interval and produce torsades. So reverse, so if you do a temporary pacing and overdrive the ventricles, you can generally get away with this condition and prevent torsades from occurring. So here you have to do a temporary pacing, not just to prevent bradycardia, but to prevent tachycardia. So you have to pace the ventricle at a rate of around 100 per minute. So this is to decrease early depolarization from occurring, to set up the re-entry inside the ventricular myocardium. And temporary pacing is especially useful in patients developing torsades due to antiarrhythmic drugs. So many of the antiarrhythmic drugs have a reverse user dependency. That means user dependency means the drugs acts when the heart rate is high, when the ion channels are open. So that is when the drug will act. Reverse user dependency means the drug will act when the patient is actually being paced. So at that time, when you pace the ventricle, the drug will not have any action and you can prevent torsades. The next one is isoproteinol to increase the heart rates. So other therapy includes with, IV potassium, even if the potassium is normal, and treatment of underlying cause like discontinuation of the affecting drug and correction of metabolic abnormalities, permanent pacemaker implantation,